Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you Shawn so much for organizing this. It's a pleasure to be here. So the topic for today's talk, as you guys know, because you're here, is the military monetary complex. And to start things off, I really love infographics, and so I figured we would start off with a reputable source, Time. You know, everybody kind of, believes Time to be somewhat trustworthy. So about a year ago, when we were pulling out of Afghanistan, Time released this great infographic about where the troops are around the world. It showed that we had a total of 1.3 million military personnel worldwide and 150,000 stationed in these foreign countries. And it showed kind of, depending on the size of the bubble, right, where and kind of the magnitude of the troops are. So we have close to 50,000 in Japan, just kind of floating in Central Command, right, which is the Middle East, 37,000 in Germany, so on and so forth. So the point of this is to show that, there's a little bit of press around, the fact that we have 1,200 troops in Belgium, but do we really think about, do we need 1,200 troops in Belgium? So that's kind of the topic of this talk is, where is this money going, and what's the impact on both those countries and ourselves? So specifically, I'm looking at military bases. So this is from another pretty reputable source that we're familiar with, right, Politico. And this shows the different bases and kind of, depending on how large the circle is, it's how many bases. And it also shows the new US strategy, which is all these little lily pads. So we've got confirmed lily pads with less than 200 personnel, and we've got a bunch of suspected kind of lily pad activity going on. And essentially here, I wanted to show you guys just the scope and the breadth of the US military presence throughout the globe. So I use essentially just these bases. So I'm not looking at any of the lily pads right now. And I'm focused on the economic impacts for both the country and for ourselves, so for the United States citizens. And then also, the bigger thing is talking about the monetary order, so the international monetary system, and how our spending dollars so profusely abroad could impact that. All right, so what do we know? There's a lot that we don't know. What do we know? So the Heritage Institute published an extensive analysis and data set for the last half of last century and showed that, I think it was 23% of all US service persons have been stationed overseas at some point. There were 54 total countries that hosted over 1,000 troops in this period. And my research found that, so kind of continuing that, in the last dozen years, there have been 24 countries that we've had over 100 troops in, and this is excluding all the countries that we have active conflicts in, right? So this is excluding Afghanistan, Iraq, any kind of civil war or strife of any kind. I exclude them from my set, and we still end up with these 24 countries. So we've got 24 countries having all these troops and an expansion usually of these bases. And then at the same time, we have foreign central banks accumulating US Treasury bills with an increasingly hungry appetite. And so this is just a depiction of those international reserves. So this is essentially the national stockpile of savings that these foreign countries they have in case of currency crises so that they can pay for imported goods and medicines. And we see that it's grown at a somewhat exponential kind of function. This is 2001 here. And these blue dark parts of each column, that's the US Treasury share. So we see that not only is the total kind of stockpiling of reserves increasing, but the stockpiling of just US Treasuries is increasing as well. And this is just by emerging countries. So we're excluding the Eurozone and Japan and a lot of those kind of advanced economies. So essentially just the countries that I'm interested in, these countries with military bases that are not undergoing conflicts. And of course, let's not forget that the US is the largest arms exporter of the world and has been for quite some time. And a lot of these countries that are the top 10 purchasers of our arms are also places with military bases. Iraq, Egypt, Australia, South Korea, Turkey, UAE. So looking at this relationship, and I'm just looking at a broader relationship, not just between the arms purchases, just of purchases of any goods and services that these countries make. Okay, so what don't we know, and kind of, why are we interested? Why should we care? So number one, does this positively impact that foreign economy? Is it a good thing that they have these bases there? Does this positively impact US business interests? In Japan, there's actually a lot of analysis and a lot of economic research about their aid, because they're the number 2 aid donor of the country. We're the number 1, they're the number 2. And they have a lot of studies and a lot of kind of conversations about, is this worth it? Is this impacting Japanese businesses enough, right? Is it, should we keep doing this kind of aid behavior? Yes, we want to do it because it's the right thing to do and stuff, but, is it actually, paying off? And so that's kind of the same question I'm asking here. Does the US expenditure abroad, do these military bases and other kind of spending, do they positively impact the United States interests? And then the last one, which I find the most interesting, but that's because I'm an economist, is whether the widespread hoarding of these dollars is beneficial to the international monetary system. So a lot of the money that's spent abroad by these US troops doesn't really come back into the United States, right? And so what are the impacts on that, both to the United States and to the foreign countries? That's a conclusion that's still in the works, but I'll share some of it with you guys at the end. All right, so jumping right in. Official development assistance. So at the start of my analysis, we spent $13 billion in official development assistance. By the end of it, we had been spending $31 billion for over 4 years or something, right? And there's been some other research that talks kind of about this insidious behavior of economic aid, right? That when the base increases, or that when the base is in existence, economic aid increases by 164%, military aid increases by 200-something%. And then when the base closes, the military aid decreases by 41%, and the economic aid decreases by 61%. So there's this kind of pay-to-play situation going on with our economic aid. And a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, through kind of going through all these Pentagon documents and stuff, he estimated that about 18% of the foreign military and economic aid is for the purposes of bribing or buying this base access. So a pretty significant chunk of the money that we're supposed to be giving away charitably, we're really just giving away so that we can park assets and people in other countries. Other kinds of ways that we spend money abroad that we're not really kind of thinking about when we're calculating this stuff, or when Congress deigns itself to greenlight a study on it, which they rarely do, is this overseas housing assistance, right? So this is a troubling kind of behavior because of the fact that it's a use it or lose it situation. So these troops and their families, they're given overseas housing allowances, and if you don't spend all of it, it goes away. So you end up just buying the most expensive thing or renting the most expensive thing that you can. And what this does is this drives up the prices, and the locals can no longer afford to live in their communities, right? So this is one of the negative kind of deleterious impacts of having these troops abroad. And there are stories of lots of these younger 18 and 19-year-olds bundling all their money together to get these huge beach houses that the locals would never be able to afford, and they're partying it up in the beach houses, and that doesn't really send the right messages, the right message in terms of U.S. diplomacy and U.S. statecraft, right? So our overseas housing allowance is a sizable chunk, and it has some kind of knock-on effects that are not the best, right, in terms of pricing people out of their own homes. We also spend a lot of money on private contractors. Oof, we love our contracts, right? And even though all these contracts by law have to be US companies, they can have little tax shelters in other countries like Dubai and other places, right? And so ostensibly this money should be coming back into the United States, but a lot of these profits are just never repatriated, right? They just sit there and they accrue in these tax havens. So oftentimes, it's argued that, contracting is more efficient and we shouldn't have the Army building latrines and this kind of stuff. But from everything that I've been able to find, and investigative journalist David K. Johnston in his great article, shows that we're overpaying for a lot of this stuff. We are overpaying, and a lot of times, unfortunately, the costs just aren't even figured into the calculations. Basing decisions, they're just, they say that costs just don't really have a part in it, right? So no wonder why there's so much bloating, and there's been $385 billion spent to these private companies to do things that the Army and other branches probably could have done. So what's happening here, and why is an economist looking into it instead of maybe a sociologist or something like that, right? And essentially, I'm focused on the fact that we have this increase in demand for US Treasury bills that's happening at the same time as this increase in the troops and the bases abroad. And I think I know the mechanisms that's underlying it. And so it starts with the US government just all of a sudden starts to spend, $100 million more in your neighborhood, right? And the income in that country is going to increase by more than that, and that has to do with the multiplier effect and John Maynard Keynes, and that's the lecture for another day. But the long and short of it is that the other country's income increases by more than what we spend there. And what do these citizens do with this other income, right? Well, what do we do with money? We buy stuff and we save it, right? So they're going to buy stuff, and some of that stuff is going to come from the US economy, right? They're going to buy goods and services from us. And then they're also going to save, and they usually save in a lot of these countries with high inflation rates and stuff like that, they save in US Treasury bills or Treasury bonds. And so what this does, and this is where the economist kind of comes in, right, is that it strains the foreign currency in such a way that the central bank is forced to choose between these three options. They can either drop their interest rates, they can do what's called sterilization, they can buy these international reserves and issue their own treasury securities, which is, that's the story of what China's doing, and that's why China has so much of our currency. It's because of the fact that we buy way more stuff from them than they sell us, so they have all these extra dollars, and with a fixed exchange rate, they pick option B. So this is another explanation, a parallel explanation to this worldwide accumulation of these international reserves, similar to the mercantilist strategy that the People's Republic of China is often accused of employing. The last thing that they can do, if they don't want to keep their exchange rate fixed, which almost every central bank in the world does to a certain degree, they manage their exchange rate to a certain degree, besides the Eurozone and the United States dollar, and even then you could argue what's quantitative easing if not managing of the exchange rate. But they could allow the exchange rate to appreciate, which would have some negative effects in terms of local businesses would no longer be able to export as much, and it would actually kind of exacerbate that buying problem, right? They would buy more of the imports, but it would tamp down on the demand for the Treasury bills if they allowed that exchange rate to appreciate. So this is the prediction. This is the work of hundreds of equations and a Python program and setting all the equations equal to each other and just doing this, just saying, okay, US government abroad goes from nothing to a little bit. What happens? And this is the predictions, right? And is it true, right? Is it true? Does the data back it up? And the answer is yes, but not as much as I wish, right? So looking at 123, so I started out with every country with the available data. And then I took away all the countries that issued reserve currencies. So the Eurozone, any country in the Eurozone, Japan, Australia, all these other kind of places, right? So if you issued something that was close to a reserve currency, I took you out. And then if there was an active conflict, right? Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, right? I took that out as well, okay? And I was left with 123 countries. So I took all these countries for 13 years, 2000 to 2012. I ran them through, statistical packages and econometric regressions and did some fixed effects and random effects and all this stuff that you guys don't care about. And at the end of it, I found that if the exchange rates managed or fixed, right, sufficiently managed or fixed, I should say, I don't see any real change in the import demand. And so that's probably because of the fact that the exchange rate variable is capturing any kind of change in import demand from the government spending. But that's my kind of qualifying. I didn't find what I wanted to there, but if the exchange rate is sufficiently free-floating, increases in US personnel by 1%, so just 1% is expected to be accompanied by a 0.1% increase in the bilateral imports. And so I'm just looking at the imports of US goods and services. So the model should actually say that the imports of everyone's goods and services should increase. But I'm just focused kind of on, is this impacting US business interests positively? So I'm looking at just the bilateral, just the ones between the United States and Uzbekistan, or just between the United States and Djibouti, okay? So I found that, that's significant enough, right? It's not as much as I'd like it to be, but there's something there. But then the thing that really kind of blew the top off it, right, was looking at the reserves. So looking at the level of reserves, if you don't have a military base compared to if you do have a military base, you would be expected to have $28 billion more in US Treasury bills given that you have a base. Controlling for GDP, controlling for price level, controlling for your own military expenditure, controlling for a variety of things. So there's a significant amount of what we can expect. The countries without these bases, we expect them to just have a significantly lower amount of these reserves. So, kind of moving on to the last question in terms of what does this mean for the international monetary order, monetary system. And for the moment, I'm still unsure. I'm still unsure in terms of the stability implications, but I can say a few things by borrowing from some very good research done at the New York Fed. If these foreign citizens hoard these dollars, instead of buying more US goods and services or buying more Treasury bills, then there's going to be a few problems, right? So the exchange rate stabilization programs, the very things that we're talking about, they're going to be less effective. The more dollars that there are, so they're kind of they're shooting themselves in the knee in a way by keep holding on to these dollars because future exchange rate interventions and future monetary policy interventions, right? When the economy's slow, you want to lower the interest rate. That's kind of hard to do when 40% of the currency is dollars in your country, right? And 2/3 of the $100 bills that the United States prints is abroad. They're abroad. 2/3. We don't know where they are. They're not here. So this kind of behavior is happening, and these kind of theoretical implications we're starting to see, right? So balance sheet implications, there's going to be more indebtedness, because at the end of the day, one of the things that we need to realize is that every dollar in a system of fiat money, every dollar that we print is essentially an IOU that we never have to make good on. And so seigniorage, the money earned from printed currency in circulation, right? It costs less than $100 to print a $100 bill. So every time we print a $100 bill and it kind of exits the system, that's a real gain for our central bank. And flip side, that's a loss of revenue for that foreign central bank, right? That's less seigniorage that they can accrue. And that's one of the main ways that these central banks build up the asset side of their balance sheet. And so they do. This is the percentage of $100 bills held outside of the United States from 1990 to 2000, starting out at 45%, going up above 70%. And this is from Board of Governors, Federal Reserve System. So don't take my word for it. And the last thing, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I'm up with my information. And the last thing that I wanted to do was leave you guys with one of my favorite little 2 minutes. I'm only going to play 2 minutes of this, of the 1961 farewell address by Dwight D. Eisenhower. And I find that people quote the wrong part of this. I'm going to play you the part that I think is very important, that I think speaks to my issue and kind of our roles as Americans and the choices that we have in terms of what our government does. All right, so I'll open it up for questions, comments, discussions at this point. Thank you guys for coming. Nate.
So I, not being an economist in any form or even really very good at math at all, when Eisenhower's talking about balance, how would you describe, from your perspective in this study, what does that balance specifically refer to, would you say?
Well, 51% of all the stuff that Congress votes on goes to war spending, goes to military spending, right? So goes to wars and goes to bases and stuff like that. So that's the discretionary stuff they actually can choose to vote on. 51, more than half of it goes towards this. So I would say that, and just the staggeringness of the numbers in terms of the hundreds of $billions every year to contractors, hundreds of $billions to kind of maintain these bases and have these aircraft carriers on the seas. So it's the balance between, how much of our economy should be public spending, and then what is the nature? What should the nature of that public spending be? And we should have a role in that. He warned us of the fact that in the past we could just transform the people that used to make, hose and agricultural equipments to making, swords and scabbards and stuff like that, right? But the nature of warfare has gotten so advanced we can't do that anymore. And so we need to maintain these industries, these sectors of the economy, and he warned us 50-something years ago that they would grow too large, they would kind of take over, that they had a captive audience with the government, and that we need to focus on a balance between that and the private kind of free market, so the other kind of sphere of a capitalistic economy. So
it's related to his cautioning us against overindulgence of the military-industrial complex.
Most definitely.
And he's saying, so the military-industrial complex is the part that you're saying people overquote, but his reasoning is actually this balance.
It's the balance question.
Hostility.
Rather than, yeah, exactly. Then I don't like military producers or whatever. I'm sure he actually did like them. He just, at the end of his tenure as president, he saw this horrible future happening, and he warned everybody. And it's one of those things where it's nice that everybody's very familiar with it in the military-industrial complex, but I wonder how much people really think about it, and people really ask themselves, is this what I want? Is this, has the military-industrial complex really gotten so out of control that I should call my congressperson and tell them, vote against the next, military appropriations bill, right? Because nobody really does. Everyone goes, oh yeah, military-industrial complex, and they just move right along. So I'm trying to look at maybe the deeper elements of our expansion across the world.
Thank
Yeah, no, great question. Yes?
Question about your methodology.
Yes, sir.
You had a slide where you said that the average reserve balance was $28 billion in 123 countries. Those 123 countries, did that include Saudi Arabia, UAE?
So it included UAE, it included Saudi Arabia. I think I excluded China because they're an outlier in every analysis. I excluded Switzerland because they're an outlier in every reserve analysis. So, but yes, I did include most of those oil-producing nations, yes.
So, but you took an average rather than the median?
I did a regression analysis. I did a fixed effects regression analysis.
Okay.
So controlling for all the characteristics unknown and known through a panel set.
Okay.
So as long as the characteristics don't change within the 12 years, I'm good, methodology-wise. That's what my econometrician people tell me.
Well, I'm just wondering how much influence, the average number, I'm just focusing on the number.
Right.
Because
It's very large.
It looks like a significant number. But
Right.
how much was that influenced by the access of Saudi Arabia and UAE to other sources for reserves, i.e. oil?
That's a very large element of it, and I could include a variable there for natural oil production, and it may impact it, but I would say that there's enough of those countries that don't have military bases that do produce a lot of oil that I think I'm okay. But that's a very good, and I should put that in there. And even just the share of exports as GDP should be a control in there as well.
I just got curious about that.
No, thank you. Thank you.
The other curiosity is, it sounds like they're stuffing dollars in their mattress. Why do they put dollar bills? You know, when you have dollar bills, you've got an actual pile of currency.
Right.
Most people would suggest if you're going to accumulate something with physical value, that you'd buy gold.
It's heavy. It takes, I mean, and to ship it from place to place, then you got to protect it. I mean, it's, you know.
What do they do with all these dollars in their $100 bills
Right.
in their mattress?
Well, so the citizens just keep the $100 bills. They use them in the informal economy. They use them in the black market. They'll use them for large anything denominated over $10,000. In a lot of these countries where the inflation rate was, I think it's like above 15% in the last 10 years or something like that. So people have been burned by prices increasing and stuff like that. They will save up for stuff in dollars, right? Because think about it, if you're, you know, broke and you're saving up money and after 3 years, you had enough to buy a car, but now cars are a third more, you know what I mean? But they're the same price in dollars, right? So that's a big thing. So
those really are in somebody's mattress?
Yeah. So the ones that aren't kind of turned into the century bank or the central bank or confiscated by the central bank, depending on the country. The ones that aren't they're just sitting there or they're circulating in these informal and black markets. Yeah, absolutely.
And one more question.
Yeah, please.
Quick. You had an analysis that said that there was a multiplier effect in the countries.
Right.
Does the very use of U.S. dollars, does it have any effect on the multiplier effect? Does it somehow stimulate the economy? Does it produce new activity?
Yes.
Rates of activity
Right.
in the economy?
Yes, definitely. Absolutely.
So that in and of itself, that has let's say the multiplier was 3 and we add the aid or we add a base and it goes to 3.5?
Right, yes.
It has that effect?
Yes, it has that effect. I mean, there have been base employees that have formed committees and commissions and stuff, and they've done research on the economic impact of a base. This was a place in Italy, and they found that it was a yes for Molin. They wanted another U.S. military base, and they said that the economic impacts would be $1.5 billion to the local economy to have this extra military base. And because there were all these people protesting, you know, no, go away GIs, you know, we don't want imperial powers here, all this other stuff, right? And he was saying, no, I was an employee there, like we benefited. And then, yeah, because those people, the employees. So it's because of the fact that a lot of the people that earn the money either directly when we build these bases, we contract a lot of locals. We contract actually a ton of Filipinos. We've got Filipinos working for us all around the world. All around the world. It's crazy that we love contracting Filipinos. The U.S. Armed Forces does. So a lot of money goes back to the Philippines in terms of remittances and stuff like that. But they're low-income jobs. And so what do low-income workers do? They spend all their money, right? Because they can't save any. But when they spend that money, if they spend it in the local economy, some of them are remitting it back home. That Filipino worker is remitting half it back home. God bless his heart. The other workers are just spending it in the domestic economy. And so that's starting and the multiplier effect has to do with the marginal propensity to consume of the people in the economy. So just the fact that it's a U.S. kind of starting the chain reaction doesn't really impact the overall, the aggregate, the final impact. That's a great question, though.
Okay, and maybe one, now I will.
All right, one last one.
One last question. Now, with all of the monies held in foreign reserves, if there were a crisis of confidence in the dollar,
Right.
what do you think would happen?
And that is the reason why my research took this direction. What do you think will happen? Do you think we would let it? Let's go back to, where is it?
When I say a crisis, regardless how it was brought on.
Right, but I mean, if the dollar fell hard enough, do you think that we would just sit back? I mean, that's not typical of behavior of the U.S. government in my lifetime or my research of it, limited as my lifetime may be. But I would argue that any sort of financial attack, I think it would be considered an attack. I mean, why did Japan bomb us in World War II? Because of trade restrictions. You know, so it wouldn't be the first time that military effort would escalate as a result of a non-military occurrence.
So you're suggesting someone would start a war if there was this crisis of confidence in the U.S. currency? That would it be? Are you describing a deliberate attack, like we're going to bomb the UAE because they are devaluing our currency, or are you saying that kind of bring something like that about?
Bombing, maybe not. Cyber attack, sure.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I could see that in a heartbeat.
So in order, how would that? I mean, again, for the super non-economist.
Yeah, I mean,
how would that be?
All I'm trying to do is just show that at the same time as we're becoming more indebted to these people, we're also building up troops and weapons and bombs in their backyard. Uh-huh. And you can make of that what you will. Uh-huh. But that's what I see.
Leave this gun here. It just sort of pointed at you. They're gonna buy a bunch of coke from you. Like, interesting.
Coca-Cola.
D.
Yeah, exactly.
So this may be this is a very simple question. Are the
Simple answer.
locals who work on these bases, are they paid in dollars or are they paid in the local currency?
They are paid in the local currency.
The local
Yep.
currency.
Yep.
The military personnel though are
Paid in dollars.
but they
Spending
have
in
to-
dollars.
But when they go into the local economy off base, do they have to change?
No, excellent question. And oftentimes they will cater to the GIs because they want the dollars, right? They want the dollars instead of their currency that's losing value every year because the government is essentially printing their way out of a deficit. So their government's printing their way out of, they're spending way too much compared to their tax revenue. So they're just going to keep printing money, and that's going to make the inflation go up. So they don't want that local currency. They want a dollar. And we actually find, this is a great question, I didn't mention this, and the next part of my research is looking at aircraft carriers. All these aircraft, you got 5,000, 6,000 young service members who they've been cooped up on a boat for months, and all of a sudden they're in a place and they can spend all this money that they've been earning that they haven't really been able to spend on the ship. And so each one of them spends at least, you've got news articles in Australia talking about $1 million to the local economy because an aircraft carrier is docking here. You've got a news article in Thailand also saying the GIs are here, like they're going to be partying and stuff, but the economic impact is really awesome, so we all should be happy. They'll have separate menus in English for GIs with prices that are high. You know, when you convert it, it's actually higher, but it's, you know, it's a convenience fee. We'd call it in economics, right? So that's a very good question, and there's no requirement for them to convert their money or anything like that. And oftentimes they don't, because in both the seller and the buyer's perspective, it's advantageous to transact in dollars.
Does that help or hurt us?
That helps us, really. I mean, because again, all these $100 bills that we print that we never get back, you know, that's essentially money from nothing, right? We printed a $100 bill, we paid for something, it never comes back around. We don't have to deal with it. So it does help us, but helps us economically. But what are the political economy repercussions of it are a whole hairy, you know, Gordian knot. It's hard enough just to trace out some semblance of how much do we spend in each place. They don't want me to know that. So I'm just trying to kind of establish some facts for which to have a discussion later on. But it's a great question. Yes?
So
Bob.
it seems that that you are, though, jumping to the political implications of it.
Well, when I talk, but not when I write.
Okay. Okay, then, because what I was thinking in terms of, you know, in terms of your entire talk was that these are really interesting results in terms of the economic,
Right.
you know, economic consequences of these military bases and military expenditures. But what's left out of the analysis is the, you know, the national security analysis.
Yes.
And I think so since you brought it up in your lecture, even though it may not be in your published research.
No, fine.
You know, then bringing in Eisenhower's critique about the military-industrial complex and the need for balance is that to demonstrate that your findings are relevant or demonstrate somehow a lack of balance.
Okay.
Then you have to tie that to a national security assessment of whether or not these bases are needed, and whether they are from a national security perspective, you know, necessary.
Well, I would argue I'm not qualified to answer that question as an economist. Yeah.
I think, and you know, I mean, it's such a wide open, like a nice economics question. It's so wide open that
Right.
it's really hard to tackle.
Right.
And so, which makes political science a lot more difficult.
Oh, yeah.
Of a discipline.
Don't get me wrong.
Obviously,
Yes,
in one
sir.
sense, although, you know, in another sense, not so. But and then the other thing I wanted to suggest, and this is just to get your reaction,
Yeah,
is
please.
that I think a more practical way use of your findings is considering these economic implications. You know, how might we operate these bases differently in order to minimize negative effects both for the host country and for the United States.
And the monetary
If
system
we
as a whole, yeah.
assume- If we just let's just make an assumption, which probably is not correct in many cases, that these bases are needed for national security purposes. Then if you discuss the implications of your research more narrowly in terms of how might we minimize the negative consequences and accentuate the positive ones, then I think, you know, that might be useful.
That's an excellent question, excellent suggestion. And I would love to team up with a political science or sociologist to get on that. I think that, and I had a response to that and I just lost it, just ran out of my head. What was the last part that you said again?
Well, I mean, you know, look at at what type, you know, just make the assumption that the base is necessary for
Right.
national security purposes. Then what are the implications of how we might maintain these bases in different ways to minimize the negative impact?
Right, and so, okay, now my response. It came back to me. It flew back, yay. That's a question about the kind of human side of it, right? I mean, everything that I've learned so far is not necessarily that the economic reality for these countries is disadvantaged. Every indicator is beneficially impacted. You know, their debt to GDP goes down, their GDP goes up. They're enjoying more imports and more savings, and they, if they want to, they can spend less on national security themselves. So I would say there's a role for me to maybe model how that would go, right? In terms of how U.S. bases that were insular, right? That, what if we just restricted all the U.S. soldiers onto the bases? You can't leave, you can't spend any money, you can't live off base. How would that impact it or something like that? But there's a big, debate between positive and normative, you know what I mean? I don't want to get too proscriptive, especially with something so controversial. So I agree that that's a necessary question. I would just say that's somebody else's hot potato.
Maybe just one thing to throw out is that, so the U.S. military needs to contract with U.S. contractors.
Need them? Maybe.
Opening that up and have, so they can contract with contractors in the host country, which would then be like foreign direct investment.
That would be a lot better, yes.
Stimulate.
What would the impact of that be? That'd be an excellent paper, and if I had I would write that down. So please, somebody remind me of that later. Yeah, that's an excellent idea. Thank you. Yeah, we can talk about that more. Yes, please.
Don't these military bases hurt the economy because they force people to use our money instead of theirs, and it causes their money to inflate?
That's a great question. So. And also, doesn't it affect our economy, right? Because that's money that's not being spent here, that's being spent over there. And so what usually happens, though, is we just keep spending more, right? We don't actually decrease the spending here. If we want to spend more money there, we just spend more money there. And if we need to borrow it, well, we're the issuer of the world currency, so we can just do that. And so the second question, you said, why wouldn't that inflate their currency?
Yeah, the currency of the area.
And absolutely, it would. And so that's why they're accumulating these international reserves, or that's why they're lowering the interest rates to try and get some of the capital to leave the country and kind of reach some sort of equilibrium there.
I think it would hurt that out, though, is that live in that area. In a way.
Yeah, that's true. But I would say that the fact that your national income is increasing is probably going to overshadow any sort of, exchange rate fluctuations or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. All it's doing is it's really kind of further constricting the policy tools your central bank can use. That's kind of the main message of it. By U.S. government spending in your backyard, we're kind of forcing you to do one of these central bank policy levers.
I think Brad, can you make that?
That's a great question. Yeah, thank you for asking it. Yes, Brad.
Is there, have you looked at any of the contracts, the negotiations for military bases? And, presumably the countries where they're being put,
yes,
they kind of know that there's...
Statute of Forces Agreement, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That there's this potential benefit. And so, does that, if that, if the benefit increases over time, that, we'd expect that to be reflected in different ways the negotiations go. We've got a presidential candidate that says he's going to get us much better deals.
Right, right.
And so presumably he would use this research to say, look, you're getting a lot out of this, you need to give us some more.
I hope he keeps a cabinet position open for me, yeah. That he could use this for that. I would not argue that that's a wholly incorrect way of thinking. Now, I would say that the U.S. benefits disproportionately compared to the rest of the world because of essentially this kind of military monetary order that we have in terms of, U.S. financial companies just kind of, they earn more money just by being U.S. and having, and being denominated in U.S. currency and stuff like that. So, U.S. goods are shipped around the world and kind of, implicitly assured by the U.S. Navy and stuff like that, right? So I would, Yes, there is that argument to be made, and I would say it's valid. I would say it's valid. Unfortunately, I would say it's valid.
I mean, is there, I mean, presumably, free market forces would kind of push the contracts more and more in our favor.
Well, but we're dealing with governments, though. We're not dealing with free markets, right? I mean, we're dealing with governments
but
trying to get reelected, so they want short-term gains. So if closing a base has a negative 61% or negative, so it's negative 61 on economic aid, negative 41 on military aid from the U.S. So you close a base, we burn you. We cut off your economic and military aid if a base closes. So you, as a policymaker, as somebody who wants to get reelected, you don't want to do that, right? I mean, that's
right.
yeah.
So that's what I'm suggesting, though, is that there would be, that over time, presumably, we would find it easier and easier to place these bases.
Yes, and that's what we've seen. The rate of base placement has accelerated over time. Yes, and well, I would say that also has to do with, the shift that happened in the early 2000s with 9/11 and other terrorist events, kind of creating NATO. Having NATO kind of really pump up its muscles and get to work in a way.
Yeah, and that's connected with Bob's point about the national security.
Right. What does it look like? How much is it national compared to Five Eyes, compared to all of NATO? No, that's a great question that I think more people should be asking of the government. Yeah, absolutely. Because we're a nation at war. We forget it too much.
If I could just add, I
Yeah.
think that's the reason it's so important to think not just in terms of transactional terms and economic transactions, and as important it is to understand the advantages and disadvantages economically, the political, not just national security, but the general diplomatic and political
Right.
aspects would probably carry more weight. I just add that in many of these countries that we're looking at and saying they're benefiting from it economically,
Right.
there's a population that's very resistant to the U.S. military base being there, even if there is an economic benefit.
Right.
But
And
we
that
make
that
the
goes to the
same-
nature of development, right? I mean, the nature of that harkens to the nature of development. It's not just the fact that GDP needs to increase, or GDP per capita, right? That could be 3 people at the top of the income ladder earning a lot of the money, which is in fact what's happening. These landowners that get the off-base, offshore housing allowances, they're getting wealthy hand over fist. But the worker that's in there, his or her standard of living is not increasing tremendously, right? Instead of working at McDonald's, now they're working on the military base at a military base Starbucks or something, right?
I mean, it could be that, but it could also be in terms of feelings of nationalism.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, absolutely.
Our
What does it mean to have a nation and our security?
And environmental impact.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
So there could be a lot of non-economic. Well, all those have economic implications, obviously.
Right.
But a lot of factors that are not strictly economic
Yes.
that would play a role in terms of whether those companies are willing to accept a military base.
Right. And whether we should do anything to stop this acceleration of the deployments. Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. The environmental impact, I mean, I can't say anything, but I'm sure they're not doing rigorous, environmental studies before they do before they plant down these bases in a lot of, in Diego Garcia and other places like that. They're doing what they want to do. They're putting aircraft strips wherever they want. Yeah. So that'll be interesting. That's a whole nother negative, consequence dimension of it. Right. This interests me because I think it's insidious. I think it's so brilliantly, we'll keep on putting our bases and personnel and people out there, and we'll go into debt, but you'll just keep on loaning us the money that we need to keep doing this. And there's no mechanism that's going to stop it. There's no automatic, the balance of payments is too much for this country. No, they don't care. They're going to let us continue to run deficits as long as we want.
So barring a steep increase in something like nationalism, non-economic force, you're saying there's really no, so what you're saying is there's no economic counter to this,
Right.
really.
There's no automatic, it would have to be a political will to stop this, either by them or by us. That right now it's this kind of self-reinforcing cycle. And what we've seen happening, which is the most disturbing thing of all, is that the demand for the US Treasury bills has just gone up and the yield has gone down. So now we're paying less on our debt and there's more people buying our debt. And so that's, that's just kind of making the whole thing much more viable in the short term. In the long term, of course, it's going to collapse.
Chris, are all these bases exclusively US bases?
Yes, they are all exclusive. Oh, that's a great question. Some of them might be NATO. I would have to double check. The ones that I'm looking at are all exclusively US bases. So all 24 of the countries that I have marked as base countries in this period are US military bases, and they're from the Department of Defense documents themselves. It's not the actual status of forces agreement, but it's the documentations where it's like, we own this much land and it's this place in Germany and it's this many square miles and stuff. So I went through that, and then I also went through the same kind of records for all the active duty US personnel that are in the countries. So the 123 countries, those are places where we don't have necessarily bases, but we've got more than 100 people that have been there in one of these years. Usually more than one. Usually it's more than 1,000 or whatever. I mean, Heritage showed that 54 countries have had over 1,000 U.S. troops on their soil in the second half of the 21st century.
These are all uniform?
Yes, active duty. Yeah, so this is not CIA, para. That's a whole nother. There's actually a great website called empire.is that does a nice job of documenting where all of the military and paramilitary, so this is military and paramilitary. And every one of these you can click on, it'll tell you where it is, and it'll give you a nice little image of it.
Oh my God.
Right? Because they think we're stupid. So they like pixelate some of these things, right? Or they just like blank them out. So they'll just be blank spots on the map. There's some really, this one right here. There's nothing happening, there's nothing going on, right? So I'm not using these yet. I'm using the official Department of Defense stuff, but this is, if you guys are interested and you want to play around with the map, empire.is, they've got it updated all the time, does a great job. This is where we are. This is where the US and NATO is. This is where your tax dollars are going. Every one of these red markers. So look at that, perfect timing. Thank you guys so much for coming. It was my profound pleasure to be here, and thank you for all your comments and questions. It really helped. Have a great evening.